Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're talking about the 2026 U.S. Senate race in the state of New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire right now, there are currently 4 Senate races that I have in the toss-up category. These are the states of Maine, Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, where New Hampshire I currently have in the lean Democratic category. So just to give you some background information on this race, the New Hampshire Senate race is currently held right now by 3-time Democratic incumbent Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Now, Shaheen, a few months ago, announced that she would not be seeking re-election to a 4th term, making this an open race. Now, New Hampshire is a very interesting state because it almost has 3 different really cycles going on here. The presidential level, the state level, the governor level, and the U.S. Senate level, because New Hampshire varies very greatly depending on these 3. So, just to give you a brief idea, in 2024, Kamala Harris defeated Donald Trump in the Grand State by 2.8%. Overall, you can look at the raw vote numbers here, Harris getting about 418,500 votes or so, Trump getting around 395,000 votes. So, for the total number of votes, a pretty competitive election in the state of New Hampshire. Trump also improving greatly on his margins from 2020 when you saw Trump versus Joe Biden in the state of New Hampshire. Joe Biden won Rockingham County by 2.1% and Carroll County by 1.5%, Sullivan by 3.6%, including Hillsborough by 7.7%. Joe Biden won this one 52.7% to Trump's 45.4%. So roughly about a 7-point victory. Now, Trump certainly made massive improvements in New Hampshire, winning Rockingham, winning Sullivan narrowly, winning Carroll County, and lessening the margin in Hillsborough. But overall, it was still enough for Kamala Harris to win the Grand State by about 3 points or so. That was New Hampshire at the presidential level. At the governor level, New Hampshire's been more of a red state, where it voted for Kelly Ayotte, the former Republican senator running for governor, by about 9.3%. Back in 2022, as New Hampshire does its governor's levels every 2 years, Chris Sununu, who that name's going to sound very familiar in just a few minutes, won this race by 15.5%. Back in 2020, he won by an even larger margin of 32%. 2018, he won by 7 points against the Democrat Kelly, and then in 2016, he won a very narrow election by 2.3%. That is at the governor level. At the Senate level, things have not gone quite so well for the Republicans. The last Senate race took place in 2022, the midterm election wave year, which was supposed to be very good for the Republicans. Then after Roe v. Wade got overturned, it seemed to be more of like a 50-50 midterm election where the Republicans and Democrats kind of both split, being well in some areas and not well in others. New Hampshire certainly ended up being a situation where the Democrats ended up doing very well. And in this race, Maggie Hassan, the Democrat, won by 9.1%, against Don Bolduc, the Republican. And that was after this race looked like it was getting very close, where it was listed by several top political analysis websites as lean Democrat or tilt Democrat, even though in the final few days, the polling got very, very close, with the Real Clear Politics average having Hassan leading over Bolduc by 1.4%. 538 had Hassan up by 2.2, 270 to win had Hassan up by 3.2. So the Democrat Hassan certainly seemed to have a lead heading into this race, but it was by no means a big blowout lead in this race, including an interesting poll in the final few days from St. Anselm College, which had Don Bolduc leading 48-47 over Maggie Hassan. That and Trafalgar being one of the final few polls to show Bolduc with a chance of winning. Now, ultimately, this ended up all breaking for Maggie Hassan, the Democrat, and the Democrats won by 9 points in the Senate race. Now, this is very important in the topic of 2026 because we have some news out of New Hampshire, 2 news parts here, a new poll and some candidate news. First, we'll go to the poll, which shows that in this current Senate race, that same place, St. Anselm College, released a new poll just a few days ago showing Democrat Chris Pappas, who's expected to be the Democratic candidate in this race, at 48%, Republican former Senator Scott Brown, who up until this point has been the likely Republican nominee, at 37%, but 15% undecided. Now, I have some thoughts on this poll. For one, the sample size of 1,800 registered voters and a margin of error of 2.3% obviously is a much larger sample size than a lot of polls at this current point in time. For instance, Qantas Insights had a 650 registered voter sample size. So it's not always 100% a perfect science, but whenever a sample size is much larger, I usually have a lot more confidence in it and that they're polling a larger of the population. And at 1,800 voters, that's certainly a very good number for this poll. It also shows, though, that Chris Pappas has a very large lead right now over Scott Brown in this race. 15% of the vote is undecided. So there is a mathematical chance in this race that Scott Brown could technically beat Chris Pappas. But for Scott Brown to beat Pappas, he would have to win at least around like 12 to 13% of undecided voters, where Pappas could only win about 2 or 3 if this poll is accurate, which is certainly a very uphill climb for Scott Brown to do against Chris Pappas. Now, this primary on the Democratic side, there is a Democratic candidate running against Pappas, but it's essentially over. Pappas, the 1st congressional district in New Hampshire U.S. representative, is going to be the Democratic nominee. The Republican primary, for a little while now, after the decision by Chris Sununu not to run for this race, it became very apparent that Scott Brown was going to become the Republican nominee in this race, until we got the news yesterday that former U.S. Senator John Edward Sununu, John E. Sununu, and the brother of former Governor Chris Sununu, is expressed interest in running for this race, and with a decision being expected by November of 2025. An article just from a few days ago, we'll open this up in a new tab here, shows that the former senator is looking at running for his old position. Now, just to give you an idea, if you haven't heard the name John E. Sununu before, he actually was a U.S. senator in the state of New Hampshire back in 2002. He defeated then Democratic Governor Jeanne Shaheen in a very close election in 2022. Now, just to give you an idea, because this is very important for context reasons, 2022 was the first midterm election in President George W. Bush's first term. In this election, Republicans won 51 Senate seats, Democrats won 49, with Republicans winning the overall national vote 49.9% to Democrats 46%. Typically, midterm elections go against the party of the president, but after everything that surrounded September 11th and everything going into Bush's term, the Republicans did a lot better in what a midterm election would usually be like, including, it seems, helping the Republicans keep this Senate race. Where Sununu actually was not the Republican senator for this race. It was before this. It was actually Republican Bob Smith. Sununu defeated him in the primary, went off to face off against him in the general election, and then defeated Democratic Governor Jeanne Shaheen, getting 51.12% of the vote to Shaheen's 46.67%. Now, this is important to mention because this is more of a Republican, or if not even midterm election environment. This was a midterm. Now, you see some familiar counties in New Hampshire, if you're familiar with the Granite State: Rockingham County, Hillsborough County, 2 out of the 3 largest counties in the state by overall population, both going to John Sununu. Now, if a Republican is going to win New Hampshire in a hypothetical election, it is crucial for that Republican to carry Rockingham County and Hillsborough County. It doesn't guarantee them to win if they carry these 2 counties, but it gives them a much stronger possibility of doing so. Just to give you an idea, in 2016, for instance, Donald Trump narrowly lost the state of New Hampshire to Hillary Clinton by 0.37%, but Trump did narrowly carry Hillsborough County by 0.2% and Rockingham by 5.8%. If Trump was able to get Hillsborough up to about 1 point or so, that would have been enough margins to win the state. So how Rockingham and Hillsborough vote is very crucial for how the state ends up voting. So that was the presidential election. And now we talk about that was 2002. Now we can talk about what happened to the Senate seat after. The other Senate seat voted for the Republican Jug Grad by 32.5%. But the next time the Senate race was up was 2008. Obviously, 2008 was definitely not 2002. 2002 was a midterm election where Republicans did better than they normally would. 2008 was one of the best Democratic election probably nights in the history of the United States. Barack Obama gets elected president, and Democrats do pretty much well in every single swing state on the United States Senate map, including some states that now we think of as solidly red states at the time, electing Democratic senators, like in Montana, South Dakota, Arkansas, Louisiana, Iowa, West Virginia, even North Carolina and Alaska to some extent. Now, New Hampshire was no different. This time, John E. Sununu was running for re-election, and he faced off in a rematch of Democrat Jeanne Shaheen, where she is no longer the governor, but she runs in a draft Shaheen movement by then Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy to get her into the race. She runs against Sununu again. Now, in this one, the election environment is much different. Sununu had decent approval ratings heading into this election, not like very unpopular or anything by that means, but in this election environment of 2008, where the Democrats were doing very well, and Senator from Illinois, Barack Obama at the time, does very well at the presidential level, he defeats Republican John McCain by 9.6% in the Granite State. Now, it should also be very important that New Hampshire's voters overall did like John McCain, especially in the Republican primary, as they did give McCain the Republican primary for New Hampshire in 2008. And Obama still won the state by 9.6%. Now, at the Senate level, things were about more competitive for Sununu here, where he lost to Shaheen by 6.3%. Now, I think there is an overall argument you could make that Sununu for 2026 may have a better chance because pretty much Jeanne Shaheen is the strongest Democratic candidate possibly in the state of New Hampshire. And no disrespect to Maggie Hassan or Chris Pappas, but I would go so far in saying that I do believe that Jeanne Shaheen is the strongest elected official in the state of New Hampshire. I think pretty much any election that she runs in, she would be guaranteed to win. And now with the benefit of hindsight, I think we know that. So it's possible that Sununu losing by 6.3%, which is about a 3-point improvement on the Senate, on the presidential race and what it is, that could be viewed by Sununu as, okay, well, this time in 2026, he won't have to face off against Jeanne Shaheen. But that doesn't mean if he were the Republican nominee, he would have an easy race against Chris Pappas either. I'll begin to that in just one second. So that was 2008. Now, the next time the Senate race was up was 2014. This was the Republican midterm wave year. This is when everything was going well for the Republicans. This is one of the better Republican elections as well. Now, in this one, New Hampshire still reelected Jeanne Shaheen, and she faced off against former Massachusetts Senator Scott Brown. In this race, 51.46%, 48.2% for Scott Brown. Still a very close race, decided by about 16,000 votes in the state of New Hampshire. Now, again, despite being very close, you could make the argument, well, Jeanne Shaheen was a very strong candidate, and the benefit of hindsight, she probably would never lose an election. But Scott Brown still, despite being from Massachusetts just 2 years prior, moving up to New Hampshire and running for this race, he still won Rockingham County and Hillsborough County, the two most important counties in the state of New Hampshire for a Republican to win in the state. He carried those two counties, which is why the results were so close. But ultimately, Jeanne Shaheen was still able to hold on and win this race. Now come 2020, no Republican that is super well known in the state wanted to run against Jeanne Shaheen because they knew what many Republicans have come to know in New Hampshire, which is it's essentially political suicide to run against Shaheen. Shaheen won by 15.6% against Republican Corky Mesner. Now comes 2026. And when you're talking about the Senate race, this will be the first time this race has not featured Jeanne Shaheen. Since 2002, it did feature Shaheen for the first time. So technically, this very specific Senate race, the last time it did not have Jeanne Shaheen in it was 1996, where Sweat faced off against the Republican Bob Smith. So the Republicans have a big opportunity here without having to face off against Jeanne Shaheen in the Senate race, which is why you're seeing a Republican like Scott Brown, someone that was pretty decent name recognition in the state of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, obviously, but in New Hampshire, running for this race. But it could also be why you see John Edward Sununu, the brother of Governor Chris Sununu, running for this race as well. There's a few situations here we have to talk about, one being the Republican primary. If Scott Brown and John Sununu face off against each other, it's going to be a really interesting situation here. Because from a candidate quality standpoint, you're having two men who are both very strong candidates in terms of being past elected officials. Both Sununu and Scott Brown have been elected. Now, Scott Brown obviously has not been elected in New Hampshire. He was elected in Massachusetts, but both of which are former U.S. senators, and Scott Brown did run a very close Senate race in 2014. So in a Sununu versus Brown primary face-off, that will be a very competitive divided primary, where if President Trump decides to weigh in and endorse one of the candidates over the other, that very well could tip the scales in that race. If not, you know Sununu is going to have the endorsement of his brother and his family. Scott Brown may have the endorsement of other local officials in New Hampshire. It'll be a very contested fight, which on its own side could potentially hurt the Republicans in the general election, as New Hampshire has the latest primary in the U.S. Senate. I believe the Republican primary and Democratic primary takes place in the middle of September, so they would only have less than 3 months to campaign for the Republican, whether it's Scott Brown or John Sununu in that race, in a messy primary. But even if that is the case, whether it's Brown or Sununu, let's say for the hypothetical argument here, it's John Sununu, he'll have to face off against the Democrat Chris Pappas. who currently right now is leading over Scott Brown by about 11 points, 48% to 37%. Now, the Republicans have the advantage in this election of not having to face off against Jeanne Shaheen, but that also means they're facing off against Chris Pappas, someone who has routinely won his first congressional district against Republicans by larger margins than the district's Cook Political Voting Index. So the district currently is listed at Democrat +2 as of 2025. Back in 2022, it was listed at even. And going back to 2020 and 2018, it was actually listed as a Republican +1 district. Chris Pappas in 2024 won by 8 points. 2022, he won by 8 points against the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. 2020, his hardest fight, he defeated the Republican Mowers by 5.1%. 2018, he won by 8.6%. Pappas has won this district by more than 5 points in every election that he has been in. So what does that say? Well, Pappas, who is born and raised in New Hampshire, lives in the Manchester area in Hillsborough County, has a really good track record in the state of New Hampshire. So this isn't exactly the case of the Republicans this time around will not be running against Jeanne Shaheen, but they're running someone that is still a very strong, formidable Democrat in his respective district and will probably be well known statewide. So this isn't a case of a former Republican senator running against a generic Democrat. This is a former Republican senator running against one of the strongest Democrats in the state of New Hampshire. I would say you probably have Jeanne Shaheen at 1, Maggie Hassan at 2, but then Chris Pappas is easily up there for number 2 or 3 in terms of the strongest elected Democrats in the state of New Hampshire. So you're going to have a very competitive race, but with Chris Pappas showing a large lead over Scott Brown here of about 11 points, the Republicans are going to be in for a very tough fight in the Granite State. Because again, I showed you the past election results in New Hampshire. At the House level, it has not had a Republican congressman or congresswoman since 2014, when Republican Frank Ginta won by 3.6%. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cycles in a row of not one Republican representing one of the two districts. And I don't expect 2026 to really change things at the House level. Now, the good news is the Republicans do have Republican governors in Kelly Ayotte and Chris Sununu going back to about 2016. So that's the best thing the Republicans have going for them in New Hampshire at the governor level. At the presidential level, New Hampshire has not voted red since 2000. 2000 it voted for George Bush by 1.3%. John Kerry won it by 1.4% in 2004, and despite close elections, it has not voted red since then. And at the Senate level, things are a little bit better, but not by much. It voted blue for Senate in 2022, blue for Senate in 2020, blue for Senate in 2016, blue for Senate in 2014. The last time it went red was 2010, when Kelly Ayotte won by 23 points in the very Republican midterm wave year of 2010, where now it seems like that is certainly the outlier of how New Hampshire votes, especially at the Senate level. So what does this mean for 2026? Well, for 2026, it's anyone's guess right now what the midterm election will end up looking like. Republicans and Democrats is still very early on, but based on how history usually works with midterm elections, you're probably going to see a night where the Democrats end up doing stronger than they normally would in an even election. It doesn't always 100% work out that way, like we saw in 2022, for instance, but based on history, the common track record or common denominator here would be the Democrats are in for a better night. So Republicans in this race, whether it's Scott Brown or John Sununu, are going to be facing off against Chris Pappas, who is a pretty strong Democratic candidate, in an election environment that's more likely to favor the Democrats in a state that at best is a lean Democratic state that has voted at the presidential level and the Senate level Democratic really since 2016. Now, the good news for the Republicans is a lot of those elections have been pretty competitive. The bad news is the ones that have not been very competitive have almost exclusively been at the Senate level, where Hassan won by 9, Shaheen won by 15.6. The last Senate race in 2016, where the Republican incumbent Kelly Ayotte defeated Maggie Hassan by 0.14%, is perhaps a glimmer of hope for the Republicans. But again, at that time, 2016, that presidential race was very close when Donald Trump won in 2016. This time around, it'll be a midterm election where the Democrats are likely going to have the upper hand. So what that all means for New Hampshire in 2026, the prospects of Sununu being the Republican candidate or Scott Brown, I still think this race is being a little bit slept on where many are going to say this race is not going to be competitive and the Republicans don't have a chance of winning it. I really don't think that's the case, because New Hampshire is an interesting state where there are a lot of independent voters in the state of New Hampshire. And depending on how everything is going, they could ultimately all swing one way or the other, and that could easily sway how this election ends up going. And both John Sununu and Scott Brown have very strong electoral track records of being U.S. senators, which I think will keep them competitive in the race and will both give them a very large pocket of money to spend in these races. But I think New Hampshire's DNA as a state at the federal level, meaning the Senate and presidential level, is at least leaned to likely Democratic. And the election year, which is still up for grabs right now, looks like it'll be more of a Democratic year than a Republican year. So right now I have this race in the lean Democratic category because I'm really waiting for more news to happen. But the news today surrounding the poll from St. Anselm suggests New Hampshire should more be in the likely Democratic category, but the news that John Sununu could be the Republican nominee would probably keep it in the lean Democratic category for now. But Sununu and the Sununu name being on the ticket would probably present the Republicans a decent opportunity in this race, or at very least help things out down ballot at the House level. But the Democrats and Chris Pappas certainly are favored in this race right now. This is going to be a very interesting one to watch. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you did, make sure to leave a comment below. Tell me all your thoughts down in the comment section and all that. Thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you in a future video.